Good judgment is something everyone would like to have, and to be seen to have. It's also one of the most important human qualities that will differentiate us from AI agents. But it turns out it's remarkably difficult to define precisely, and many people are not sure whether they personally possess it. Sir Andrew Likierman of the London Business School has spent his life talking to leaders in a wide range of fields, from business and the army to law and medicine, in an effort to create a framework for understanding judgment. First, he had to define the word. He now suggests that judgment is the combination of personal qualities with relevant knowledge and experience to form opinions and take decisions. He argues that, thus defined, judgment involves a process, taking in information, deciding whom and what to trust, summarizing one's personal knowledge, checking any prior beliefs or feelings, summarizing the available choices, and then making a decision. At each stage, decision makers must ask themselves questions such as whether they have the relevant experience and expertise to make the choice, and whether the option they favor is practical. Expertise can be useful in making judgments, but it's not the same thing. Academics have expertise, he observes. They don't necessarily have judgment. People with judgment know when they're out of their depth in making a decision, and typically then seek the advice of someone who has the right background and knowledge. In this fascinating conversation, Andrew Likierman gives us a tour of his lifetime's work into the art of judgment. Tune in to an important conversation on The Evolving Leader. So welcome to the show. Andrew, would you just give us a sense of who you are, your background, and the things that you have done?
Right. Well, I've done a lot of very different things, and that is actually relevant to the subject at hand here, because I've had the opportunity to see good and bad judgment in many different contexts. So I started out in commercial life. I was involved in manufacturing. I actually ran a textile plant in Germany. I then moved into academic life. I then moved back into commercial life. I then moved back into academic life. I then moved into government. I moved back into academic life. I moved into government again. And now I'm back in academic life. And in academic life, I've been involved both as a teacher and researcher, but also as an administrator. So I was dean of the London Business School for a period of time. And why, as I said, that I believe that's relevant is because I've seen just what good judgment can do and what judgment really, why it's so important and why it's potentially so disastrous for organizations.
Thank you. So it seems so obvious to us, this word judgment. We all have an understanding of it, but let's set the scene and describe what is judgment. What's the big picture here, and why do you think this conversation is so important right now?
Well, looking at the question of what judgment is, so I've defined it, and there is no standard definition. It's defined even differently in dictionaries around the world. What I've defined it as being the combination of the personal qualities that we have as individuals, and therefore what we bring to the judgment, in relation to the relevant knowledge and experience we have in relation to this particular choice. And you've noticed there that I'm talking about this particular choice. One of the reasons why, understandably, very little research is done in this area is if each judgment is different to every other judgment, this is a nightmare as far as research is concerned in a conventional sense, because it's very, very difficult to pin down the reasons why things are different, and therefore to kind of make sense of a hypothesis which can be proved or disproved in a conventional academic way. So for me, this is about very much the context of a particular choice and the way we approach that choice. This is really the key to the work that I've been doing.
So we'll come a little bit more to the kind of ecosystem or the kind of different aspects of what judgment is. But again, what does bad judgment look like?
Well, I think we all know what bad judgment looks like, because I'm sure we've all been the victim of bad judgment. When other people make bad judgments, they affect a lot of other people. A bad leader, bad here defined as someone who has not got good judgment, can be disastrous for an organization. I mean, taking all the wrong decisions, making all the wrong choices, even making one single disastrous choice can be enough to wreck an organization. So it can be very bad indeed to be at the receiving end of bad judgment, which is why, it's another reason why it's not just a question of saying, what it's important to recognize and exercise good judgment, but also it's very important to not to exercise bad judgment and to recognize it in other people. Because if you hire somebody who's got bad judgment and they're responsible to you, well, it's a bit of a nightmare, because you can't rely on them, you can't trust them. I mean, they can do the most strange things. And if you're their boss, then you carry the can for that. So I'm suggesting that bad judgment is very, very obvious. We see it, if just take some examples in the press, very often when people resign from senior positions, they say, it was an error of judgment. And they are right very often. Doing the wrong things, cheating, whatever it is, flouting the rules, doing something that's completely unacceptable is bad judgment. And sadly, as I say, almost any scandal has got the words bad judgment or poor judgment, or it was an error of judgment, or it was a huge error of judgment even, attached to the resignations involved. So, as I say, that's, this is high-stakes stuff.
In your recent book, which I loved, Judgment at Work, and this is what kind of drew me to inviting you onto the show, you make that distinction of lots of different gradations of bad judgment, ranging from fairly mild, everyday kind of things that we do to catastrophic types of error. And I suppose one of the problems that we've got is that this is conflated with intelligence and character and morality even, and so on, self-awareness. There's a whole range of things here that when people talk about judgment, when you say someone's got bad judgment, you could be describing them as. So can we look at this systematic approach, the components of judgment that you have started to identify?
So I'm approaching this with the assumption that all of us benefit potentially from understanding more about the processes that we make judgment about. That, in doing our jobs, and indeed in our private lives as well, we know the stakes are high, and therefore it is worth approaching this more systematically than simply hoping for the best or assuming the experience we've got is enough and whatever it is. So that's the basis in which I say, look, you really need to look at this more systematically. And I'll briefly go through the different elements involved here, and I'm happy to expound, in more detail if you like. The first thing is, and I've already alluded to it, it's the knowledge and experience that we bring to a particular action. Now, if we've done something 50 times, the 51st time is really pretty easy, because unless something's changed, and let's assume it hasn't, then we bring a lot of knowledge and experience to bear. If we've never done something, then frankly, the risks involved are much, much higher. And we need to recognize that. Even in our private lives, we go on holiday, we go on holiday to a new place. Well, we've got to make quite a lot of assumptions on the way. We can help ourselves greatly by doing a number of things I'm going to suggest. But you can see here the risks of not having done something before are there. And if we're doing something like a merger and acquisition, if we're doing something like a big IT project where lots is involved for the organization, then this is not a trifling issue. So that's number one. Number two is the question of the awareness we have of what's happening when we make our choice as part of a judgment. And that awareness can be about the situation, the people involved, what their motivations are, understanding the dynamics in the room when a choice is made, things like that. This is very much the question of what's happening when the choice itself is being made. The third one is the trust we have in the people and the data and the information that we get. All of us rely on other people. We don't do things on our own. We rely on other people to help us with our gaps, the knowledge and experience we don't have. We ask people, we ask experts, so on, to come in and help us. The question is, can we trust them? And that's the third element here, allied to which we have the question of whether we have trust in the data that we get. Now, fake news is in the news, as it were. We know about that. But we know we have to be careful. The fact is, not everything on the internet is quality controlled. Not everything that we necessarily get. I mean, even from ChatGPT, I asked ChatGPT to direct me somewhere in a foreign capital, and I'm afraid it took me to the wrong place. But actually, that's partly because I gave it the wrong instructions. But what I'm saying is, you can't just say, oh, it's all right, ChatGPT would answer all my questions in life. Not quite enough. So, number 3 then is trust. Number 4 are the feelings and beliefs we have. Now, we all have feelings and beliefs. We come to any choice we make thinking, well, do I feel good about this? Do I feel optimistic? And so on. So that whole area, which includes our biases and our prejudices and our values and all the kinds of things, is really the kind of filters that we have through which all this information flows before we make a choice. And we're probably not conscious of most of it, but I'm going to argue we should be conscious of it because it does affect the quality of our judgments. That brings us to number 5, which is when we actually make a choice. And we've all sat in rooms where we can see that the choice is being made on a very good basis, very rational basis. Arguments are taken account of. People argue and counter with each other. To me, there's a sense of getting what's best out of the room. And I'm sure we've all been in situations where, bluntly, this has not been so, where you have let's say, a dominant chairman who basically squashes all dissent and just tells people really what they ought to be thinking. I mean, that's just one example of the way in which the process itself can go wrong. On the other hand, if it can be done well, that's fantastic. Bringing all the data together, bringing all the contributions into the room together and so on. Finally, there's the question for decisions we make of whether we can deliver it. Because bluntly, it's no use saying, I think this is a great idea if bluntly it's not deliverable. So I would say that ability to deliver is part of the mechanism. Now, I've gone through those 6, not always easy to remember, but that's what I mean by the components of the judgment process.
And it's not an entirely linear process, is it?
It isn't, no. And I've gone through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but actually in many cases we might say, all right, let's say we get to a meeting to decide something. The meeting says, look, we can either do this or we can not do it. And somebody says, probably quite rightly, let's say, because the risks may be very high here, of saying, look, why don't we try it out? Why don't we pilot it in one area first to see if it works, and then we'll perhaps do it thing. Now, that's a third option which has been brought forward at the choice. Now, that may not have been thought about, so back you go to, if everybody agrees actually that's a way of mitigating risk, then back you go to have another chance at looking at what's involved in that. You might say, look, it's not feasible to do it for just a little bit of the organisation to pilot it, whatever it is, and you may then eventually dismiss that. But let's say you do decide at least to take it seriously, you'd need to go back to an earlier stage. So there is a process of reformulating ideas as one goes through the judgment process.
In your research, when you look at this way of thinking about judgment, do you see kind of cultural differences where one aspect of this is stronger or weaker in different kind of cultures or parts of the world? Or is it fairly, kind of random?
No, and this is something I was very conscious of in doing this work. I mean, I'm privileged to work at a business school which is incredibly international, and therefore I have access to people from, many, many different countries around the world. I mean, we have 106 countries currently represented on campus. Now, I've also been around talking to groups in, for example, cultures which are seen as different, particularly different, including Japan and China. And I have asked people there directly, look, do you think this applies to you? And for example, in Japan, I was told, look, the process by which we make our choices is not the same as that as you do in the UK or Western Europe. The process itself is different, but we recognize what you're saying here in terms of these different elements of the judgment process. And we don't think you should change them for Japan. We would apply them, though, in a different way. So my sense is, and I've talked to people, Argentina, I've talked to people in very, very different cultures in different parts of the world. And I've actually challenged and asked them to say, do you think this would apply to you? Or should I be thinking about something different for you? They have not come up with something which is different. So, of course, everybody is different. Every organization is different. Every country is different. But I think the basis of looking at these big categories, I would say, is not universal, but can be applied almost anywhere.
As you said at the beginning, you've been studying this for a long time,
yeah.
And you must have seen a change in how leaders make decisions, because obviously they're making a lot of decisions today in very shorter cycles of time, and kind of strategic planning cycles have sped up, and the complexity of organizations and so on, and the level of uncertainty. How are you seeing judgment changing in its relative importance, or the nature of judgment during that time?
Well, you're right to say that things have speeded up. I mean, I think people are impatient to get on with things. The sort of lengthy research process, which might have been fine 2 or 3 decades ago, people say the world is moving too fast. We can't afford to do that. I don't think that's any issue here at all in terms of the way one looks at judgment, because what you're doing, in essence, you're saying, all right, we won't do an absolutely comprehensive study on whether we should enter this new market, whether we should have this product, whether we should hire this person. We will actually, the thing needs to go faster. So I would say that's fine. You have also to recognize that if you're speeding things up, if you're not doing the kind of due diligence which you might otherwise have chosen to do, then you have to recognize you are taking more risk. And you may say, that's fine, we've got to take certain risks, we're prepared to take the risks. So I don't think there's anything wrong or anything different about saying we're working in a world which is anxious to get on with things, perhaps not as careful as might have been seen to be right a while ago, but risk is really where you're at. If you're prepared to take a risk, and, all this is about taking risk, question is how much risk you're prepared to take, then, that's fine. I mean, I think, but you just have to understand what you're doing when you do it.
Yeah. And when you look at organizations which you're constantly talking to across these 6 different areas, how many do you see, what proportion do you see that have a more systematic approach to judgment?
Well, one of the fascinating things for me is that actually there are very few organizations which look really carefully at this process. A lot of organizations, well-run organizations, will be doing quite a lot of this anyway. They will try and make sure, I just give you one example, that when they hire somebody, there is a systematic process in place for hiring people, and they will try and make sure that the final choice is not dominated by a single individual and so on. So this is the kind of thing which it seems to me one needs to look out for if one isn't already doing it really well. And I'm not suggesting, people who are involved in good practice suddenly have to rethink the good practice. Good practice is great. It's when you're not, when you're not sure about whether you've got good practice or not, whether you think to yourself, actually, am I confident about this choice that we are about to make? That particularly you need to be aware of the process. So I would say well-run organizations in general do this well, because one of the definitions of doing something well is exercising judgment well. And organizations that get themselves into trouble, by definition, are not doing very well on the judgment front. So, I think it's a kind of thing which is demonstrated by outcomes. My work is trying to help people not be part of those who are demonstrated to be doing things badly in terms of the outcomes. I mean, if you want to as I keep on putting it, stack the cards in your favor of making a good choice, I think you ought to approach judgment systematically.
So what are you advising leaders who want to build a culture of good judgment? And I'm thinking particularly this, the kind of self-awareness piece around here, which is so critical to be able to stand back and go, are we falling into intelligence traps or biases and so on? What do you do to encourage people to do that?
Well, the first thing, it seems to me, is that one needs to incorporate the idea that judgment's important in the way one hires people and assesses them and promotes them. So if you say, actually, we're looking for people with good judgment when you hire people, I mean, that's one of the criteria you should be using. Similarly, in the appraisal process, once you've got an idea of what judgment is, you can put that in as one of the things you're looking for, not just is somebody, has got particular qualities in terms of their personality, but actually have they got good judgment? It's something worth talking about at an appraisal interview annually, whatever it is. And also, if you're thinking about the question, can we move somebody up from this job to a more senior level job? One of the things that person is almost certainly going to be required to do is to exercise more judgment, because that's what seniority means. I mean, why do we pay senior leaders large amounts of money for what they do? I mean, one of the things is because one relies on their judgment, and that is not a quality one can take for granted. So building it in, first of all, means building it in for who you hire and the way you promote people and the way you appraise them. And then there's the question of saying, okay, let's identify what things we can improve. And you mentioned awareness. There's plenty of a way which you can get people to be more aware of what's going on around them. You don't have to say, I'm either born with it or I'm not, because bluntly, this is something you can train people to do. In the book, what I do is I've got a long list. I mean, it was even longer, but I thought to myself, this is getting too long, of things you can actually do. How can you, get better at each of these elements of judgment? Well, there's lots of ways you can do it. I mean, the most obvious ones, of course, are to do with training, are to do with learning from colleagues, and so on. But there are a lot of ways in which you can improve individual parts of the judgment that you exercise. And it's not incredibly difficult, and it's not incredibly expensive. It's something which all of us can do. Of course, I'm a biased witness here, so I admit to that. But I reckon the payoff is pretty high in terms of what an organization gets out of this.
So as I'm listening to this show, and I've got one of the world's most renowned experts in judgment, and I'm thinking to myself, well, tell me what I could be doing right now to start improving my judgment. What are the kind of simple, practical things that anybody could start doing as a leader?
Well, I would say, that you need first of all to identify what are the things that actually you think you're not terribly good at? What are your weaknesses? And I'm just taking one completely, arbitrarily here. Let's say your knowledge of artificial intelligence is not as good as it might be, and so you're not as aware of the potential for AI to be applied in your organization. Now, you'll immediately have seen what the answer to that is. If you don't know enough about AI, well, find out about AI. Get going. Make sure you understand the relevant bits so that you can make an informed choice about the applications of AI in your organization. And each of us will have different ways of doing that. So, there may be not much needed in one organization and a lot in another. And you've got to think about the question then is, do I have the time? Can I do this? Let's say hypothetically you can't. Then the question is, how can you get somebody with the knowledge or people with the knowledge to advise you on what you should be doing? And again, it comes back to it's people you trust. Now, I've just taken one example of one element of judgment, but in essence, what I'm suggesting here is one has to take stock of who one is and what one knows and what one does, and identify those things. And I think simply being aware of it, and one may not be aware of it having not thought about this before in this kind of way, will lead you towards the actions which you need to take. I'm not saying training core. Of course, I'm involved in training, so of course you'd expect me to think training is a great idea. But, the question is, what are you being trained at? And it's often something which can be quite precise and may not take very much time. So self-identification followed by action related to that is what I think one needs to do to help one on the way.
Our show is very interested in how we navigate uncertainty. So I'm interested to get your take on how judgment helps us with prediction and forecasting and embracing uncertainty.
Well, look, we're all subject to this. All of us, and we, at the moment, we're living in a particularly uncertain world with a lot of variables involved that we bluntly haven't had before. This is not like anything else, the current uncertainty. But then that's been true over the last few years. If you add up the combination, of COVID, which produced one kind of uncertainty, the Ukraine war produced another kind of uncertainty, and so on, that, we all having to grapple with this. All right. So, in terms of the judgment process, forecasting is a very good area where you say, all right, how good is my judgment in assessing forecasts? I have people who work for me and they produce forecasts. I read stuff in the technical press, I read stuff in the newspapers and so on, and we have experts talking about various aspects of the future. Now, I would argue that we know that forecasting is a really hazardous basis for saying, what is going to happen, because analogies are difficult. This current uncertainty, I'm talking 2025, is not the same as 2024 or of 2020 or 2008, going back to the financial crisis. Every time we've got a different kind of uncertainty in relation to forecasting. So, what do I suggest? I suggest that the two most important things you've got to think about in any forecast is who or what is making the forecast, number one. In other words, do you trust this source? Do you believe this source is able to answer the questions you want? That's one. And the other person that's involved here is you. You're taking in this forecast, you're reacting to it. If somebody is telling you something you don't like the look of, you will know that your tendency is to reject it and say, oh, I think that's over-optimistic, or I think that's over-pessimistic, whatever it is. What judgment is all about is saying, what's my reaction to this forecast, and who is making the forecast. So it is not just a question of saying, have they actually done the sums right? Because the sums are the starting point. The end point is your belief or lack of belief in the forecast that you get.
So, another way of putting that is, do you trust your own reaction to the data? How do you help people to think about their feelings and beliefs and the influence? Because that kind of emotional conviction can be very, very, compelling in terms of feeling like it's truth.
It does, and I'm sure all of us have a tendency to, we welcome the views that accord with our own views much more enthusiastically than something that's inconvenient or contrary to what we believe. So we tend to filter anyway. So the kinds of things I think one needs to do is to say, first of all, am I aware of my own biases, my own tendencies when I get information of various kinds, and becoming aware of them and making sure that one understands why one is reacting in a certain way is the starting point, really, about improving one's abilities in this respect. Second way is the question of having people around one who provide counterviews where required and, where something needs to be argued out. I mean, the difficulty many people have when they achieve a lot of power and they're surrounded by people telling them how wonderful they are is that they kind of lose perspective. They only really want to hear the people who say the things that they already believe. And so it happens quite often that somebody gets to a position of power and their judgment actually then starts to deteriorate because they become overconfident based on the position that they hold and the way in which others basically don't tell them the truth and don't provide counterviews for fear of offending them in some way or jeopardizing their own positions. So having people around you who don't necessarily just agree with everything you say and provide a good balance of views is, again, that seems to me another way in which one has that greater sense of perspective. So it's understanding yourself, but also understanding your relation to other people and allowing them to help you make better judgments.
What might be missing in the education system that would begin the journey for people to have better judgment? Because judgment doesn't just apply in a business context. It applies in every other aspect of the choices that we make in our lives.
It does, and what happens is we kind of pick these things up as we go along. We make mistakes, and if we're wise, we learn from the mistakes, and we don't do it again. And if one's never made a mistake, that's probably because you're taking too little risk. So mistakes can be very valuable in terms of of getting better judgment. So I think it's a question of saying, as far as is looking at oneself to say, how can I use my experience to improve what I do, as well as all the other things potentially that are going to help me on the way.
You've taught several generations of leaders about judgment. Have you noticed any difference in the evolution of those generations regarding judgment, or is it pretty stable?
I'm quite cautious about making judgment of that kind. I mean, I've had the privilege of teaching people over a number of decades. I've actually taught more than one generation of the same family. That's how long I've been at this. And I think that people vary so hugely in who they are. I mean, obviously the cultural backgrounds, very, very important in terms of the way people approach things of this kind. So I'm going to avoid answering your question by saying, no, I don't think I can. I don't think I can discern. Actually, I don't think I can. because for me, it's very much about treating people as individuals. And in this particular case, one may have grown up in a culture where certain things are the norm, but actually you're not the norm. So you don't conform to that. So no, I can't give you help on that one, I think.
No, I'm with you on that one. I think this is something that we actually have a fairly contrary view in our world, in that we're very much on your side, that we don't really see these differences. Of course, there's a different context. If I was growing up in this environment as a 20-year-old, I'd probably react, but I'm not sure that's actually the generational thing. I think that's just a context thing. So yeah, I'm with you. What else should we be talking about in terms of judgment? Where are the areas of greatest opportunity for leaders to expand their judgment, do you feel?
Well, look, I think I've talked a lot about weaknesses and remedying them, but I think one should also be thinking about one's strengths and, what the individual or the organization is really good at, because that gives potentially comparative advantage. If you're better at this kind of thing than your competitors, that is a big plus. And so I don't think it's a question simply of saying, find out the things you're bad at and try and get rid of them, or at least be aware of them. I think it's also a question of building your strengths, building your capabilities. And again, if one thinks about an organization which has a great capacity for making good choices, isn't that just what you think about being a well-run organization means? It can actually get to grips with the things that matter about its operations and its future and the way it operates in the world. And I've seen organizations of this kind, and they are wonderful to work for, because there's a sense of purpose and there's a sense of, the ability to turn purpose into action that is exhilarating. And similarly, I've worked in organizations where you just feel it's all a great big quagmire, where nothing happens, everything's bogged down in bureaucracy, nothing ever gets done, and so on. And having mentioned the word bureaucracy, I should also say that I'm not assuming here that all not-for-profit and public organizations somehow don't exercise good judgment. Because again, I've worked for organizations which have been brilliant in this way. So the fact that you haven't got a profit motive doesn't mean to say suddenly you don't have good judgment. The quality of the people is really what matters. And and that applies in both public and private sectors. So, I'm talking about a quagmire where, rules are more important than anything else, and, you can't get anything done, and so on and so on. And judgment then is virtually impossible to operate in an environment like that. So, a new leader coming in and saying, what is the difference I can make? It seems to me, through the business of saying, how do we make our choices and how can we make our choices better? My belief is this is one way in which you turn a failing or mediocre organization into a really good one.
And we've touched on AI in the sense that, we're part of the systematic approach to this is trusting the sources of data, or assessing your trust in the sources of data and your own reactions to what that's happening. Can we talk about how AI is changing the game in judgment?
Well, what I think is really, really interesting for me is the relationship between AI and judgment more generally. Because I've been grappling, as part of the work I've done, with the question, can a machine exercise judgment? And in doing that, I've talked to a lot of people, some of the leaders in artificial intelligence. I've talked to philosophers. I've talked to people who are at the cutting edge of what's going on. Now, as a result of that, my belief is that the machine, through AI, is going to become more and more and more sophisticated. We know that is so. And a number of things the machine will be able to do, which are bluntly better than the human being. And if I take the field of medicine, which I quote in my book, so what we know from a doctor who did a study on this is a lot of things that are wrong with one. Bluntly, the machine is much better than a human being in finding out what's going on, because you can program it to find out with a much higher degree of probability than human beings are able to offer. Now, that is fantastic. That's really great. But it doesn't then mean by extension that the doctor will become irrelevant in an age of AI. What the doctor is going to be able to do is to do the things that AI can't do, which is look at a patient with complex psychological issues allied to their physical issues and say, I can see the pattern here, and the kind of approach I'd have based on many years of experience is we should approach it in this and this way. Now, you can't program machines to take account of these kinds of factors. The doctors will be much better and more gainfully employed for everybody, doing detailed work face-to-face with patients, which the machine cannot do. What the machine will be able to do, you can see I'm optimistic here, I declare my bias, what the machine will be able to do is a lot of the routine work that the doctor currently has to do, freeing the doctor to do what the doctor does best. So, my belief is that in an age of AI, one of the things that a human being will be bluntly left with to do, and do well potentially, with the right training, the right background and so on, is to exercise judgment. So in terms of looking at who's going to be doing what in an age of AI, my belief is that judgment is going to become more important as what human beings do, juxtaposed with the increasing sophistication of the machine.
And that suggests something in that example that you've given there, which is that the elements of what the human being are doing are, in terms of psychological assessment, the ability to kind of reflect on that and understand how your beliefs and feelings are kind of interacting with that data, suggests that, if anything, the stakes for judgment go higher. It becomes more complicated. It becomes a more sophisticated skill that we have to develop, rather than relying on knowledge and experience. We're actually having to. So, what does that mean in terms of how we develop that? Because that's a very high order form of critical thinking and self-awareness.
It is, and that's what human beings are amazingly good at their best. We are really, really impressive at doing this kind of thing. But, it has to be recognized that this is something which human beings need to have, need to develop, need to provide, without saying, oh my goodness, what are human beings going to do? They're going to do a bit of this and a bit of that. Well, no. I mean, they're going to have to do some very, very precise things that where human beings have got comparative advantage. And the people who have got good judgment, it seems to me, are going to be in much higher demand than those who haven't, because they can offer more than the machine. If somebody's simply doing something, more or less the same as, or not as well as a machine, then I don't think they have a very rosy future. So that's another reason why I believe we ought to focus on judgment in order to equip ourselves in an age of AI to work with the machines.
And that makes total sense. I guess the question it begs then from a commercial point of view is, how do we measure judgment? If we look at two doctors or two accountants who've got the equal kind of experience, track record, status, etc., and then you're saying, well, the differential now in the future will be their judgment. How do you measure that?
Well, I've worked with a regulator dealing with exactly this issue. So the regulator regulates professional firms, and the professional firms are required to exercise professional judgment. Now, the question is, so what is professional judgment here? And if something has gone wrong, does that mean, therefore, that professional judgment wasn't exercised? The key element and distinction one needs to make here is to say, if there is a judgment process and somebody can demonstrate that they have gone through the judgment process and done everything they can to achieve what was necessary, then that is a demonstration of good judgment. Why I'm focusing on process rather than outcome is that outcomes are determined by things which are nothing to do with our ability to exercise judgment. I mean, for a start off, we have luck. Luck is a key factor in success in a lot of things in life. Of course, we like to say, that was bad luck when things don't go for us. But quite often we say, well, actually, that's, modestly, that was due to my excellent qualities when things go in our favour, even though we may have had a great deal of luck. You can't link necessarily judgment and outcomes because of things like luck. I mean, the other elements are to do with timing. There may be the question of, whether the data is good enough and so on. There's lots of reasons why this is not a simple thing to do. So simply saying, if something is successful, by definition, it must be due to good judgment, may not be right. It may simply be due to luck or the fact that other people, had a disaster on their hands and that was actually benefited us, whatever it is. So for me, it's about the question of process. Can you demonstrate that you did everything you reasonably could to make a choice as good as possible? Now, that is the exercise of judgment. So I would say judgment can be measured in terms of saying, has a process been followed to give the best possible chance of success?
Who do you think's doing that well outside of kind of regulated sectors? I mean, you meet lots of leaders who's kind of not falling into the trap of confusing outcomes driven by luck versus judgment.
Well, I would say all those people who may not have thought about judgment itself, but these kind of techniques where people systematically look at the reasons for success and the reasons for failure and always try and improve what they're trying to do on the basis of learning from what went well and what went badly. Now, the quality of analysis has to be there too, because you can't simply make a correlation and hope for the best because circumstances change. So the looking at outcomes has to be linked to a rigorous look at the reasons why things were as they were. I mean, if I just take analogies, people say, well, it's just like last week or last month or the financial crisis or whatever it is. Well, actually, it isn't. Life develops very, very differently. It's difficult always to say that you have exactly the same thing going on. You know what I mean? And you need to differentiate in each case. Is it exactly the same as last time? Are we aware, that word again, awareness, are we aware of what might be different? So I think here that, it's the learning part, which is fundamental to good management in any field, is an important part of judgment as well.
If the conversations we've been having on The Evolving Leader have helped you in any way, please head over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a rating and review. Thank you for listening. Now let's get back to the conversation.
When we talked before, you described the pain of writing this book because, creating any kind of holistic, systematic approach to a topic where you're integrating lots of different disciplines is very hard. It's a tough thing to leave things out. So two kind of final questions, really. One is, what did you leave out that you'd like to bring back and put into this conversation? And what's next for you in terms of your research?
Okay, leaving out. Well, I left loads out. I wrote the book, and my editor said, "Oh, you can't put all this in. It's unmanageable. You've got to leave lots of stuff out." So sadly, many things hit the cutting room floor.
What's the most interesting thing you left on the table?
Oh, goodness me. No, you've got me there. I'll need to think about that. Okay. But in terms of what I'm excited by what happens now, because what I'm trying to do now, and my focus throughout this has been not here is an interesting subject, let me look at it, but how can I actually help people to make better choices? So what I'm doing at the moment is I'm applying it in many different areas. I mentioned professions, I mentioned regulation. I've already worked on independent judgment on the board and what that is to help directors understand their legal obligations in that area. I'm working with the Family Firm Institute on how to apply this within a family firm context. I'm working with various training bodies to see how I can help on the training process to get people better doing what they're doing. I'm working with financial institutions to help on the decision-making process there and how they can improve that. So for me, this is a very exciting time to say, all right, let's see where we can apply this, because since choice is pretty universal, there's no limit to what's possible. So you can see why I'm kind of excited by the next stage.
And if you could get privileged access, I'm sure you've got very good access into lots of incredible places. But you're looking at the world right now and saying there really needs to be some better judgment exercised here. Where would you like access to?
There is a very, very obvious place, a very obvious person, but I'm afraid even my wildest fantasies would not.
They're not listening.
Assume that I'm going to get anywhere near whoever that person is, who anybody here might be thinking about. No, I mean, look, I'd be, if people in positions of authority and positions of responsibility find this useful, then that's big for me.
Yeah, well, I'm sure they will, because this is, as you say, the differential that humans have in an automating world, and to be able to better understand your own capacity for judgment, identify the blind spots or the weaknesses, shore those up, get extra support in, and then amplify the areas where you're strong will give you that that forward kind of momentum in your career and help you to build the organization that you need to build. So I think that's a really great place to leave it, Andrew. And I'm very grateful for your time. I know how busy you are, so we're deeply appreciative of spending this hour with you. And everybody should get a copy of Judgment at Work. I read it over the summer, and it opened my eyes to lots of things that were incredibly valuable for me as a practitioner, but also for my own business and development. So I thoroughly recommend that, and we'll leave details of Andrew's work in the show notes and a link to the book as well. So remember, folks, the world is evolving. Are you?